Good evening and welcome to the Tuesday, February 27, 2024 study session of the Olympia City Council. For the record, we have a quorum with all council members present. This evening we'll be receiving a briefing from the city's hearing examiner. So just a few highlights to frame our discussion for this evening. There are a few topics of discussion that we'll be discussing this evening. First, safe walking routes in high school students, the pace of development in the city, equity issues, and conflicting policies in the city's comprehensive plan. So I'm going to now turn things over to Tim Smith, our Deputy Director for Community Planning and Development, to get us started. Tim.
Right, thank you, Mayor, and good evening, City Council. So tonight we have hopefully an interesting dialogue with you this evening. With me today we have Mark Scheibmeyer, who's the city's hearing examiner under contract with the city. We also have Nicole Floyd, who's our principal planner that oversees the current planning team that brings projects to Mr. Scheibmeyer for public hearing. And we have Leonard Bauer, the Director of Community Planning and Development. And so I'm just going to give a short kind of overview of the hearing examiner process, just to highlight some of the important points, and then quickly turn it over to Mark to have a conversation with the City Council, because that's what they're here for tonight. So Mark, Mr. Scheibmeyer has been with the city as our hearing examiner since 2013. In 2021, the city did do, at the direction of the City Council, a search for a hearing examiner through an RFQ process, conducted interviews, and then ultimately reselected Mr. Scheibmeyer to continue as the hearing examiner. Currently, he's under contract for 2 years, which with a 2-year rollover at the approval of the city and Mr. Scheibmeyer, and that contract is set to expire in April of this year, and so that'll be an amendment that we'll need to be discussing with City Council in the future. So in terms of the role of the hearing examiner, that's spelled out in our municipal code. The city conducts the process in concert with state law, but our code specifically calls out the purpose of the hearing examiner, which I think is important to highlight. And that's to separate the land use regulatory function from the land use planning process, to ensure procedural due process and appearance of fairness in land use regulatory hearings and decisions, to provide an efficient and effective land use regulatory system which integrates the public hearing and decision-making processes for land use matters, provide for consistency and predictability in land use decision-making in the application of policies and regulations adopted by the city, and then lastly, to establish clear and understandable rules governing the land use decision-making process. It's also important to point out the difference in the permit review process from our long-range planning process. That's the process that the City Council sees most often. Examples are our comprehensive plan update we're currently involved with, as well as the Capital Mall Triangle. That's a legislative process and is therefore, there's no real limitation on rules for public input. In fact, the city encourages a high rate of public input throughout the process. For example, the Capital Mall Triangle is now at a stage where we're holding 6 public meetings in the next few weeks in March to gain public input that will help guide the City Council on a decision on that subarea plan. Permit review is different. It's called a quasi-judicial matter, and what that means is we're applying adopted plans and regulations to determine the legal rights, duties, and privileges for specific parties or properties. What that means is a couple of other additional requirements that come into play. One is the fairness doctrine. This is a rule that makes sure hearings are fair with rules about when public testimony can be accepted. We also operate under state law, RCW 3670B, which provides for no more than 1 open record hearing and 1 closed record appeal for each project. And so to conform with these requirements, the city, like many cities throughout the state of Washington, have chosen to hire a hearing examiner to conduct these proceedings. So the hearing examiner sees public hearings and makes decisions on a wide range of projects. These include large residential subdivisions, land use applications, certain types, shoreline permits, certain types of those, conditional use permits, and also he sees appeals of any administrative staff decision. And so that's virtually every permit that our department issues is subject to appeal to the hearing examiner. Hearing examiner decisions, for the most part, are appealable to Superior Court, and so the council really is not in the loop at all on those, with the exception of a couple items such as site-specific rezones and master plan amendments, and those are recommendations that the hearing examiner makes to the City Council for final action. There is one such matter, the Evergreen Park Plan Unit Development Amendment, that's before the City Council next week, so therefore we won't be talking about that issue this evening. So really the purpose of this meeting is a regular check-in. We've done this a few times in the past few years, for the hearing examiner to report back to the City Council about what he has seen in the community in terms of issues that come up at hearings, what types of comments are being made from the public, and in looking at the comprehensive plan and development regulations, are there areas where there's conflict or maybe we need to look at some improvements. And so this is really a feedback loop that provides that opportunity of a conversation between the City Council and the hearing examiner. And so with that, unless anyone has any questions, I'll pass it off to Mr. Scheibmeier.
Thanks, Tim. Your mic. And before you get started, I just have a question. Would you prefer to take questions in the middle of your presentation, or would you prefer that we hold
I'm good
questions?
at any time there.
Okay, great.
Your preference.
Great, thank you.
I was going to just an offhand comment. I grew up in Kansas in a family of 10. And so this gathering is just like dinner. It almost is identical to our dinner table. So feeling like home. Good evening. I've been your hearing examiner for a little over a decade now, and this is, I think, time number 3 that we've gathered, and I appreciate the opportunity. Hope it's beneficial to you as well. And while a few of you have been around for a while, most of you are newer faces, and so I welcome the opportunity for you to find out who your hearing examiner is, and also to have some dialogue and to better understand how this is working for the city. So Tim had asked if I had any things to talk about, and that's where the agenda you see in front of you, those are topics that I had suggested, but they're by no means exhaustive. They're simply some things I thought I'd bring to your attention. You may have your own complete or fuller list, and I welcome any things that you would like to talk about, recognizing that certain things, my thought process in a decision is not for discussion, and of course anything that's pending would not be for discussion. But outside of that, I welcome any discussion that you would like to have. So as far as the last year has gone, it's been a relatively quiet year. There's only been a handful of decisions I've been asked to render for the city. None of them are particularly remarkable. There's always some degree of controversy in any land use decision, but I would describe this year's as less so than many. And so I wouldn't regard this last year as being noteworthy in any large respect. And I hope no member of the public takes offense that I didn't regard the project they spoke to as being less important, but they were all important, of course. None were of a larger magnitude of importance. And if there's any of them that you would like to discuss, be more than willing to, but they weren't, again, altogether that notable, other than they're a reminder of the challenges that Olympia faces, perhaps more than many cities, in that its growth will, to a certain extent, be infill, more so than many cities. And infill is an interesting process. It raises equity issues because it's more expensive. It raises environmental issues because it tends to be the properties that were gone over the first time because of more environmentally challenging conditions. It raises all sorts of questions that cities who have the ability to expand outward rather than inward simply aren't encountering in the same way. But Olympia does encounter that and encounters it fairly significantly. And so that's certainly a part of the land use decision making here, and it's part of your comprehensive planning as well that we may talk about a little bit later on. But there's a bit of that in the decisions that arose this past year. Several of them were infill type issues that highlighted the challenges that are found when you parachute in a newer, more intensive development into well-established, primarily single-family residential neighborhoods, and the square peg and round hole circumstances that you encounter with that, and as well as the difference between public policy and local perception. So anyway, those are some of the things that we're currently finding and or found in some of the decisions rendered this last year, which segue to some of the issues that I listed here, because they tend to arrive out of those hearings. And without further ado, the first it was, again, I mentioned safe walking routes and high school students. This arose out of the recent Middle Street Townhomes project, where it was pointed out that the cities, well, let me back up, at the state level, RCW 90.58 is the state law regulating subdivisions, and it's applicable to all cities, and then all cities incorporate it into their subdivision laws, as well as impose their own regulations. Part of that subdivision law at the state level and imposed at the city level is that every new subdivision must take into consideration safe walking routes for students. And that's an important consideration. It's interpreted differently in different locations, and it arose in the recent Middle Street Townhome project because the project is close to the high school, and the question is, did accommodation need to be made for safe walking for high school students? And it was pointed out that Olympia's policy is not to require proof of safe walking for high school students, that its policy is for grade school and middle school students, but by agreement with the Olympia School District, that does not extend to high school students. And so my decision was based upon that. It wouldn't have arguably changed the decision, but it was based upon the recognition that in Olympia, safe walking is not regarded as required for high school students, meaning proof of sidewalks within a certain distance. I'd have you think about that policy. I'm not the policymaker, but I would have you give some thought to that on an equity basis, because I think it's based upon the notion that most high school students can drive, and that they're disinclined to walk to school. But that's a policy that's largely applicable to more affluent students and less so to less well-off students, and that raises equity issues. And so I'd have you think about whether you might want to re-engage with the Olympia School District on the question of safe walking for high school students. It's not the biggest issue in the world, but it's an interesting issue, and it's an equity question, and cities are very much attuned to equity issues at this time, and I'd invite you to add that to your list of equity considerations. So, sure.
We got an email from a constituent about this just like a week or so ago, and I'm just curious, since we're on the record, can we get a little bit of story about that, how that became policy, and what, whether that had legislative involvement or not?
I can speak to that. There's a memo we have, and the memo is from 2003. It's been updated over time, and it probably needs to be updated again. It does a lot of good things. It helps us understand, like, what do we mean by safe walking routes? Because the state law and our municipal code talk about it, but it's brief. It doesn't really give a lot of detail of like what we mean. And so the memo says within a mile, because bus routes are required more than a mile out. It talks about what is a safe route. What is that gravel? No. Does it need to be paved? Yes. Like how we build it. So there's a lot in there that's really still applicable, but this particular piece could be revised, and we could work with the school district on how to do that.
And then just the last part of my question, was that a council adopted memo or a staff negotiated, like staff to staff memo?
It's been to council because I've seen in the file that it has some I think it was more presented to council as like, here's some information. I don't know, Leonard, do you want to speak to that?
I believe that's correct, and it was before all of our times. So again, an update may be needed. I did want to add, though, in this particular case, Middle Street Townhomes, as staff was reviewing that, we did determine there actually is a safe walking route from the townhomes to the high school. So it wasn't an issue of there not being one in this particular case. Nevertheless, this issue is still there, and that memo probably still does need some reviewing.
Yeah, Leonard explained that better than I did, that it wouldn't have led to a different decision, but it was pointed out as being an omission in the policy. So,
Councilmember Madron, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious in terms of, well, it's not for you, sorry, but in terms of changing this policy, is this a staff-driven thing, or does council make the decision on this?
I think we would welcome council's direction on it, and we can move forward on trying to come up with some options to bring.
Okay, and is this something that I mean, of course, we want to stay engaged with the school district, but is this something that we need to negotiate with them, or can we just make that a requirement?
I would certainly recommend that you give us time to talk with the school district and get their thoughts on it, including potentially the school board, if that's appropriate on their end, so that we're all in agreement on what that would look like.
Okay, yeah. Well, and I knew he would do that, but the way that it was described before, it's like we needed to go to the table with them, and it sounds to me like it's also just a decision that we can make.
My impression, based on I guess I'll call it the oral history of this memo, is that there was some confusion because, as Nicole pointed out, the statute really isn't very detailed. It just talks about providing safe walking routes to those who need them, I think is the term in the statute.
Okay.
So my understanding was that at that time that both the staff of the district and the city were kind of trying to figure out how this applies and where it applies, and so they said, well, let's get together, put something together, document it, share it with the council at the time, and then move forward using that as their guidance.
Okay.
But it's been a long time, and situations certainly have changed.
Well, and since we have a meeting coming up with the school district, can we add this to the agenda of things to talk about with them? I think we might as well, and it's something that I'd like us to figure out sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and just some additional background. I mean, the no high school provision is a very strict interpretation of state law. And so, we can obviously go above and beyond and interpret that differently. So I think the goal is to, update our policy, but maybe long-term when we update our subdivision code to actually codify language within the code itself.
The other thing, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. And then Councilmember Cooper.
Oh, I'm sorry. The other thing that I think is kind of important to think about is that we have two high schools. So Olympia High School has an elementary school next to it. So even if you were to say, well, it only applies to high schools, there's an elementary school there, so then you're still catching it. And then you have Capitol High School that is the one that I think you would be thinking about. Okay, so have we missed it? In what way? Is there an area that could be subdivided in any way within a mile? And minimally, yes. So I think that if you were is this an emergency? Do we need to fix this right away? I think we could just start sort of looking at that immediately, and then as time progresses, we can update the code, we can update the memo, but it's relatively easy to just start looking at that.
I can't believe I'm going to use this as an example, but we just negotiated a package with the school district for a high school that was largely built around safe walking routes to school. Mm-hmm. So I feel like we've set a precedent that memo is no longer applicable in the city, just because of the time we spent on that conversation, to be honest.
City Manager Bernie.
Well, and a lot has changed between the council of 2003 and the council of now too. I mean, our whole transportation master plan has changed, and our focus around mobility has changed. And so that wasn't something that was in front of that council at that time. So just kind of different spheres of kind of what those different councils are wrestling with. So I think now is the time to look at the memo and have the conversation with the district. I mean, I'm certainly seeing head nods around the table from the council that that's certainly a direction you want to go. And I think Nicole's point's a valid one. It's probably not something that you have to take urgent action on, but we should have the conversation with them, make sure they understand it, and then start to move in that direction.
Councilmember Gilman.
I know we're kind of down a bunny hole here, but I just wanted to clarify that there's 4 high schools in the Olympia School District, because both Avanti and Orla have high school students also. Luckily, they're both in proximity to grade school people, so that, but I experienced that when I was working at South Sound High School, because that district and city also decided to not provide a school crossing because they're high school kids. They can fend for themselves. And it was, so we're not the only ones to make this decision, but it's not a very helpful decision. So.
Councilmember Parsley.
This is just so I understand the process, and maybe I just dug the bunny hole to China, but How often do we set policy for planning based on a memo?
I guess I would clarify this differently. This is an interpretation, and we often have memos that, whether it's memos internally or memos, from a director's decision, we call them, or which is actually codified, that the director can make decisions on interpretation of code or statute. And that's essentially what this is. It's an interpretation of statute that both the school district staff and the city staff have to implement together. So having an agreement on how that interpretation is to be approached is not unusual. We do that on other issues as well, including lot with the affordable housing, which eventually was in code, but prior to that, we started working on that through some communications back and forth. So there's been a number, and there are quite a number of interpretation memos that we have.
Okay, that actually is very helpful. Is it often when we have RCWs that are a little bit loose and not really strict?
Yes, yeah, very often. The three of us are in the office fairly often working through things like this, and we try to memorialize those as much as possible. We have a whole file that Nicole's team looks at to try to be consistent with these over time once we've made a decision.
All right, we'll turn it back over to Councilmember Vanderpool.
So under the current 2003 memo, how much of it is the city paying for it, and how much of it is, if they're needed to update it as we go through this revision process, hopefully, how much of it is the school district paying for it, or how much would be us? Well, is the developer, but I'm saying if we needed to update it.
Neither.
Neither.
It would be the developer.
Just the developer?
Yes.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thanks. And this next one, I'm not sure where I'm going with it, so bear with me. And I'll sort of lay it out, and then we'll figure out what I meant by even stating it here. And by way of background, over the last couple of years, for reasons that I didn't see coming, I've become the hearing examiner for a great many cities. The list of jurisdictions that I now handle is grown logarithmically the last couple of years, such that over the last 3 or 4 years, Lakewood, Gig Harbor, Longview, Tumwater, Yelm, Buckley, Black Diamond, I'm missing several other important ones, and then a number of other smaller ones have all become my jurisdictions. And so, since we last gathered, I'm gaining perspective from a lot of other communities, and I thought it might be interesting to share that. I'm not sure, because every community is different, and that's in addition to the ones I've had historically. And so a couple of observations from that, as well as one outside observation, which is, as you've undoubtedly been informed, our state legislature in the last go-around has told cities that they have to think about development in a different way, a more aggressive way, a faster way, that there is this legislative directive to find additional housing and more importantly, to find additional affordable housing, two things that aren't necessarily close to the same. But so there's all those things going on, and hence my note as to the pace of development both here and elsewhere. And I don't have clear points to make other than perhaps that of all the larger jurisdictions I'm dealing with, and let me build my point a little bit more. Matters that come before me aren't real telltales of a city's true development. One, because development approval is years before actual development. Development lags a considerable period of time. But more importantly, a lot of types of development simply don't come to me. New apartment complexes almost never come to me unless they're part of a mixed-use facility. A lot of things don't come to me, so I only see bits and pieces of what are happening in cities, and it's that peekaboo look that it can be actually kind of misleading often. So take what, my observations at less than full value because of it being a lesser observation. Having said all that, having laid that long runway to get airborne, I'm simply seeing a lot less development in Olympia than I'm seeing in all my other jurisdictions. Its pace of development, at least that's coming to me, is dramatically less than what's coming to my other cities. And does that mean something? I have no idea. All I'm pointing out is that it's lesser, and that now some are aberrations. Black Diamond is the fastest growing city by percentage in the state. It would love to slow down. It isn't finding the ability. Buckley and Yelm are of a similar nature. They're just exploding and trying to figure out how to deal with explosion. So there's that end of the spectrum with cities that are trying to put the brakes on a little bit, but forces are forcing them in a different direction. And then there's kind of the Olympia on the other end that really isn't seeing a lot of that development. I'm just noting it. I don't know its causes. I don't know if it's, I'm not being judgmental about that. It's just an observation, not a judgment of any kind. It may be, in part, the difficulties that this city faces to develop because it's hemmed in, and its development, again, mostly will be internal to a certain extent. And like I said before, internal development is simply more challenging than external development. But yet, it is more favorable under the GMA. The GMA wants us to develop internally, not externally, for a lot of good policy reasons. But when we do so, we find challenges. We find that a lot of developers would prefer less restriction in that regard, that a lot of our neighbors find it problematic and unpleasant, and that it finds us clashing our goals, that it clashes our notions of traditional neighborhoods with notions of equity, with notions of environmental protection. All those come colliding together when we start infilling our cities as the GMA has directed. So again, I just listen to myself, and I'm myself unsure of what I was pointing out, other than the city does have challenges. I recognize those. I also recognize that it's simply not showing the kind of development that I'm seeing in the other cities within the South Puget Sound area. So, observation made. I don't know if you gain anything from that. So.
I do have a question about what you said, though, in regards to other cities in the GMA. They're bound by the GMA just as much as we are, aren't they? So
well,
I'm
sorry.
quite following.
My point being that they're growing more into their urban growth areas, their allowed urban growth areas, and less internally. And they're taking advantage of that opportunity to expand to the extent they're allowed by the GMA to expand, rather than to bring themselves back in. And so, you look at a Yelm, it's growing outwardly, and it's doing so at a very rapid pace because it has that inventory of undeveloped lands, relatively environmentally insignificant impacts, and so it's seeing that a great expansion, rapid expansion. Buckley is the same thing. It's out on the prairie. It's got a large urban growth area. It can expand easily, and it has a heavy push to expand. And so different places have different constraints, and it may be those environmental constraints or geographic constraints that are binding Olympia. It's just that I have not seen a lot of development come in front of me that would expand the city's housing base, that would establish new neighborhoods, that sort of thing. So.
Leonard.
Sorry, I can't resist. Just to comment, I think Mr. Scheibmeier may have answered his own question, which is, earlier mentioning some of the things that come before hearing examiners include subdivisions, and that is, I assume, a large part of what some of these other developments are is subdividing, vacant land, which, yes, Olympia definitely does not do many subdivisions. When we do, they're fairly small because our parcels are fairly small, but in terms of housing units, as you've seen from our reports, we're seeing quite a bit of development, but it's more of the type that doesn't come before the hearing examiner. It's single buildings, apartments, that sort of thing. So that would be my observation.
Councilmember Parsley, followed by Councilmember Gilman.
Some of these jurisdictions, I'm assuming their GMA boundaries were drawn before the Hearst decision. Are they running up against that?
Just in terms of water supply issues, you mean? Yelm certainly had a water supply issue that it resolved. I don't know of any others. The King County ones work off, Black Diamond works off a regional water system, and so all of East King County is basically one water system. As far as the foothill cities in Pierce County, I haven't seen where any of them are encountering water limitations. And none of the others have expressed it. At least it's not come up in any of my recent decisions.
And then just to follow up on that, I think I heard about one of the jurisdictions in our own county worrying about the gopher and offsetting some of the gopher impact.
Well, the Mazama pocket gopher is definitely an issue for development. And yes, Yelm, again, is one that's significantly impacted. There are certain areas, I think I'm telling you what you may already know, that the pocket gopher is inclined to a certain type of soil and environment, more conducive to certain prairie communities and less so to forested communities. And so as you go through Thurston County and elsewhere, you find different conditions which impact that more or less. Tumwater is, again, in certain areas impacted by that. So yeah, I think they're looking for larger, more global solutions to some of that. I'm not privy to what they are.
I think Mr. Scheibmeier has primed a conversation that we'll continue. We'll have a couple more touches, which is about the housing allocation work that we're working on regionally, because it's really a question of how much we allow sprawl in the urban growth areas to meet our population anticipated growth, and how much we hold the line of the kind of dense development that we're aspiring to, and then what share our suburban and rural neighbors will take of that growth that's expected for the county. So I just say thank you for elevating this issue, and it is something we'll be able to wrestle with a couple of times in the next few months.
So if I may launch into a corollary to all that, not a direct corollary, but an important additional observation which has to do with the pace of development and how it takes place in the process of development. So some of these communities are priding themselves on the speed at which they can deliver new housing, and they boast of that, and they argue as a selling point to their approaches. Olympia has a different approach, and it's an approach I appreciate, which is it's a strong neighborhood-based development review, which picks up, sort of creates institutional friction along the way to make projects looked at more carefully and slowly than many cities would do. But of all the cities and counties I deal with, there is none that comes close to the level of neighborhood involvement that Olympia has. It's not even close. And that's to its credit. Now, it also means that projects take longer, and it also invites challenges to projects that might not occur if they were silently moved through the system, as some cities like to do. So it's just an observation that pace of growth is a product of many things, but one of which is the way in which the city approaches its development. And Olympia chooses to take a more thoughtful, somewhat slower process to absorb all of that information and to hear fully from its constituents before it acts. Now, that could be a pain in the rear end, but it's an important pain in the rear end. And so sometimes you may hear from your citizens that, not enough is being heard from them. Well, I would respectfully beg to differ. As compared to any other city I'm familiar with, you're getting more input, or you're inviting more input than any other community I know, so.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Vanderpool, followed by Councilmember Cooper.
Of the projects that you've seen that would be higher density or mixed use, of those, could you give us examples of ones that failed out because it didn't match certain standards that we have, or like it just, the interest died away? I'm curious about those examples as we're thinking about our comprehensive plan, we're thinking about zoning.
I think I lost you in the question. I'm sorry. I have not seen any projects. Well, I never know what happens. I don't follow up on projects. I don't know which ones go and which ones get tabled, by the developer after they've been approved.
Yeah.
I don't have any way of tracking. But as to ones that come to me, there have been none that have been denied that I can think of in the last many years. Many have been altered in their format or their conditions along the way, but none have been denied. So that's where I got a little bit lost in your question.
Yeah, it was just a matter of like, so when they get altered over time, what were the reasons for that? For a couple of examples?
Oh, well, I have to be careful about things that might come back before the council. But Briggs Village being an example of a project that has been modified over time to sort of reshape it to fit some of its realities, if you will. I don't know if that's a fair term or not. I had the exact same thing happen in Yelm recently, where, again, a large-scale master plan development found that it had regulated the amount of commercial development, and that was seeking a way out of that. So it came to me on a recommendation back to City Council, just as the Briggs had come to me on a recommendation to the City Council. So I'm finding those in communities where we always have to be mindful that all we can do is our best in envisioning the future and where it will take us. And we can be bold in some of that vision, and it can fail miserably, and that's not anyone's fault. It's just that the future didn't come quite as we had foreseen. So it's not uncommon for us in our master planning to impose certain ideas and expectations and requirements, and then have the real world, if you will, come out slightly differently. So we have to be adaptive to that, I think, to a certain extent. But those are policy decisions for you to make, and I'll leave it there. I don't want to suggest any greater discussion about that, but those are the kinds of things where we're sometimes seeing some of the notions that arose in the early 2000s, grand notions. Some have played out well, some have not played out as well, as we learn from our experiences. So,
thank you.
I think it's interesting that there's some pitfalls that I would predict for those other cities that you're talking about, because I think our maturity model is further along. As you say, we're in an infill space now. Largely, our UGAs have been built out pre-modern development, so they're a bigger risk. In fact, to the point where we've had the exact opposite outcome of the planning of UGAs and urban and growth management, by getting all of the development in the UGAs throughout the state and almost none of it in the actual inside of the cities. And so I think that's a cautionary tale for them, because once you lock in single-family residency throughout the city, now you're in the place we're in, where do we build so that we can get the density to meet the growth projections? I want to ask you a question that's a little bit adjacent to your wheelhouse, because you're in two other counties. So one of the struggles that we have is it can take a decade sometimes or more to get the county to update the codes that we've written to apply them to the urban growth area. Do you see any different systems in Pierce or King County that allow those policies to be more live in real time?
Sorry, I don't have an involvement enough. I'm in 5 counties, no, 6. And so, I recognize, well, first of all, also doing land use in the counties themselves as opposed to some of the municipalities. I'm very much aware of the different philosophies at the county level versus the city level. And I'm also aware of the tension between the county, who oftentimes is the final regulator, and the cities who have to live with that regulation or are seeking the regulation and are having the county struggle to impose it. So I don't know so much as I'm offering anything, simply agreeing with you that there are challenges in that regard. And in some of my communities, I'm seeing tremendous, friction, sometimes the other direction, where counties are just scratching their heads looking at these cities at the pace they're growing and wondering why that's happening, and wishing they could do a little bit more about that. And then your situation in cities, hoping that the counties would be a bit more responsive, and yet are slow to do so. I'm beyond acknowledging it. I don't really have any input.
Yeah, I just think it hinders our ability to see that infill in the UGA unless we annex. So.
Well, and the GMA was established on the notion that has not been proven to be in error, that controlled growth and infill growth overall is a far more environmentally and economically sound approach to development than continuous outward expansion. It's premised on that notion, and that notion hasn't been proven to be wrong, but it's more expensive. It invites challenges with long-standing existing uses, and it also raises the risk of environmental challenge. It has the potential of pitting planning interest and equitable housing interest against environmental interest in a way that can pit what would normally be compatriots against each other. So it just has a lot of tensions that need to be worked out and take more effort to achieve, and unfortunately raise the cost. So infill development is simply more expensive, generally speaking, than any other type of development.
City Manager Bernie.
Yeah, I just thought I'd go back to Councilmember Vanderpool's question around, kind of things that make their way to the hearing examiner and things get approved or denied. And certainly, projects get appealed from time to time from those who have concerns about them, and those have to be addressed. But I'm wondering if Nicole or Tim or Leonard could just talk about the staff work that happens with developers. I mean, it doesn't really serve any of us to continually send projects forward to the hearing examiner that are going to get denied, right? So there's work that happens up front to make sure development happens. Maybe you guys could talk just a bit about your work.
So reflecting on what Mr. Scheibmeier was talking about with like the projects he sees, I would say that my bread and butter, or my team's bread and butter, is apartments. We see lots of them. They come and at a rate that is, I don't know, I think we approve a lot of not subdivisions, but apartment style buildings, commercial on the ground floor, apartments on the top, things of that nature. But those don't go to the hearing examiner unless appealed. So there's a lot of that. When we talk about like what projects like get stopped, it's an interesting process. The pre-submission conference, I think, is a really good pulse on what's happening. I don't have an exact number, but a lot of pre-submission conferences are somebody coming in to say, does this pencil? Does this make sense? Should I buy this property? And the answer is often no. There's going to be the number of units that I can build doesn't pencil. There's going to be infrastructure. There's not as much space as I thought because of stormwater or tree protection or you name it. There's a variety of different layers of code requirements that are sometimes seen as impediments to a profit. Because at the end of the day, nobody's going to do something unless they can make money off of it. And how that all comes out is through this process of the pre-sub first. I would say at least 25% of pre-subs just die because the person who came in got the information they needed, which was, I don't want to buy this property. The pedestrian-oriented related things that I have to do on the frontage cost a lot of money, and I'm just not interested. And then people, if they make it past that, they apply for the permit, the land use process, which has a robust public engagement part, but it also goes through an incredible amount of review from the Site Plan Review Committee, who are a group of experts that look at it from all of the different code-related issues. And a lot of times what will happen is we'll get them a first-round review, we'll hand it to them and say that this is what you would need to change. And they say, well, that doesn't pencil, I'm not gonna do that. And then they just walk away. So that project doesn't necessarily like go to an appeal. There's nothing really happens. It's not flashy. It just kind of goes away. They never respond. And so that is what happens. And you can go through 2 or 3 layers of those, and each time it gets a little bit better. And so eventually, and most projects go through that enough times, change, and then if they are going to go to the hearing examiner, that's what gets sent to the hearing examiner. And that's why I think, I've heard people in the community say, well, how come the examiner approves these? Well, because they don't get to the examiner until they get to that place. It's not economically viable for the applicant to continue pushing forward when they know that they don't have a place where they meet code. So that's, I think, part of it. The same is true if it's a director determination or decision. It wouldn't get approved unless it met code. We would end up in a situation where we would have to say, well, it's denied. So that, I think, helps explain how that works. Is that? Okay.
Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen.
Yeah, Nicole, I have a question. Thanks for that explanation. I feel like we hear about things not penciling often for developers. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit? Like, what does that look like, other than them telling us that it might not be feasible for them? You know, are they sitting there laying out all the numbers with you and your team, or so how do we, what does that mean to not pencil? And how do we know if it truly doesn't pencil?
I don't know. That's a great question. It's something people say, because what pencils for them is this number. It's a profit number that they need to reach, and that's not something they typically discuss with us. So when somebody says that doesn't pencil, that means that their profit margin isn't enough for them to continue with the project. But I don't honestly know what that is, and it's different for everyone.
Yeah, part of that can be, the profit that they would personally make from it. Another part of it has to do with the financing that they can secure to do the project, and what financiers are asking them to demonstrate to be able to even do the project and have the resources to do it.
Tim, followed by Councilmember Parsley. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what Nicole was talking about too, and about what Councilmember Nguyen was asking about financing. One of the outcomes of a pre-submission conference is the developer gets an idea of what our development standards are. And what we found through time is that sometimes development standards will greatly exceed the cost, resulting in the development not working. And so we've taken a look at that lately. One thing that the City Council passed most recently was a change to our engineering development and design standards, where we can waive certain what we call frontage improvements if the project is small enough to not warrant it. So if their investment in the property, for example, the former Greyhound station's an example, they want to redevelop that into a restaurant type of use, but they're required to do some extensive street and frontage sidewalk improvements that exceeded the costs that they had. And so with the change, it exempted them from that. So it allowed for adaptive reuse of that building. And so it's something that staff are tracking to make sure that, the costs are, realistic and something that can help a project move forward. Because if projects don't happen, then we don't get those improvements anyway. So it's something that we're keeping track of, and we'll bring to City Council as they see issues that come up.
Thanks so much, Tim. So I have a follow-up on that. I think the real question here, at least for me, is that there is a distrust of development in the community. Not by everyone, but by some, right? And so so I'm asking, how do we trust when something pencils or doesn't pencil, right? And not necessarily like on an individual basis of a developer that's before us with a project in mind, but how do we know that as a city, whatever we're asking for is really within the realm of reasonable for a developer, right? And I think, so if you could talk a little bit more about that, I think maybe that kind of would get at that trust part, because we're not going to know, and we don't have the time, right? Staff don't have the time to figure out what every individual private developer wants, right? So, but I think a lot about that trust factor. How do we know?
Yeah, I mean, they don't show us their books, but I guess the best indicator is they simply don't move forward with a project. For example, another example is where we have the new Vic's Pizza up Martin Way. That was going to be a Dutch Bros, but Dutch Bros required a drive-through, which triggered repaving and reconstructing 3 adjacent streets, a bulb out and a sidewalk. And they said, we can't afford this, and they walked. Vic's came in and they cut out the drive-through. That reduced their trip rate, so they didn't have to do those investments. And so I guess, we just have anecdotal information, but typically we can tell through the pre-submission conference and the outcomes and the conversations whether or not a project's going to move forward or not, just based upon the requirements that we're telling them they have to comply with.
There's another piece to that, and that is that you don't have to necessarily trust an individual person, because the property and how many times it's been looked over by a variety of people can sort of speak to that as well. So there's pieces of property that are, for example, 1 acre, low-density residentially zoned. They're very difficult to get to pencil because they're in this weird sweet spot. Well, it's not sweet. It's really kind of like a bad spot where you can't get enough density to cover the costs. And it doesn't matter who you talk to. It's across the board. I can see it. I can see somebody walking, and I'm looking at this 1 acre piece of property. That's going to be hard, right? I don't have to trust anybody because each of them comes up with the same list of issues. It's how we ended up with working on the missing middle ordinance that went a long ways and is still going. But those layers of code complexity were sort of filtered out to the top to say, like, look, if we looked at a 1 acre piece of property, what is getting in the way of getting the level of density that we're looking at for it? So it's not always just trusting someone, but trusting many someones.
Just quickly, I appreciate that, and I don't mean to demonize developers, though. I think it's important to just talk about that. There by some in the community is not that trust there, and as much as we want development, good, thoughtful development that reaches our goals, we have a lot of different goals beyond profit. I really don't, other than making sure that we're in good standing. We don't really have a profit interest. I don't feel. So we have a different charge, right? We have to be the sort of like balancing the good. And so a developer's interest, rightly so, is not necessarily what a city council member's interest is going to be. So I appreciate the space for the conversation. And it does sound like there are ways that Olympia is continuously trying to balance, like, what are we asking for? Not so much, what individual developers can pencil, but we're always looking at that. So, and thanks for the backstory about all these properties, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mayor Pro Tem. I think a lot of people in our community have the questions that you just asked. Councilmember Parsley.
Well, a comment and then a question, and the question's probably too like a pie in the sky, but the comment is also to go to Councilmember Madrone's answer. It's not just the profit, it's also what the bank is going to let you do. And that's based on a factor, not just how much you're spending, but how much you're going to make in the future. Can you pay off the loan? And they will cut you off at the knees if they think that's not going to happen. And if you're basing your funding on a bank loan, SBA loan, whatever loan, the bank will have the final say, not the developer or the builder. My question is, because we've been talking back and forth about our neighborhood centers, is there anything that's like sticking out when you're looking at pre-subs in some of these neighborhood centers for people that might want to do a mixed use that's like holding us up from allowing these to develop into neighborhood centers? Any other portion of some of our zoning and codes that are like, ooh, this piece of property is never going to get developed the way we want it to be?
It's a great timing for that question, because the neighborhood centers study is just wrapping up and will be coming to the land use committee, I think next month, I believe it is, the following month, and then to council with findings around those very questions for our neighborhood centers specifically. What has been holding up development in the neighborhood centers? And there will be some very specific recommendations in that study that we can follow up on.
Look forward to your report.
All right, back over to you.
Just one last comment, and I'm sorry if my just raising this issue led to a lot of scattered discussion. I hope it's valuable, but one last reminder, and that our state legislature has charged every city with sharing in the responsibility of finding housing and affordable housing. And so the answer is not to say, well, that the city to the next of us, it's growing, it can take care of that. That's not what everybody has been told to do. It's a shared responsibility. And it is easy sometimes to be comfortable with what you have and accept and to really enjoy your city as it is and your neighborhoods as they are. But you are under this directive to be seeking innovative ways to find available housing for additional individuals. So just that, I'm telling you what you well know. The next issue was equity issue. So here's the background on that one. I was asked to chat with the city council of another nearby city. And the first question posed was, well, Mr. Scheitmeyer, if you are a hearing examiner, how would you carry out our policies and vision toward achieving equity? And I gave a real crappy answer. I forget all that I said, but I wasn't anticipating the answer or the question as well as I just didn't see it coming. And so my answer was scattered. It was a good effort, but I don't think it was a terribly good answer. It's led me to keep thinking about that question ever since. And I still don't have a great answer, but let me try to talk about equity in the context of land use decision making. So equity really has two concepts. There is the historic legal concept. You've probably heard of courts of equity, along an English notion that sometimes our laws simply create harsh results, that solutions other than strict application of the laws should be found. And so that, in other words, that courts should find equity or render equitable decisions rather than strictly legal decisions. So that's the historic notion of equity. And if I could talk to that for just a second, I want to make you aware that I do not render equitable decisions of that nature because you have not given me that authority. And so to the extent that people come to me seeking equitable remedies, I have to disappoint them and explain that I am not the giver of equity. It is the city council who has decided my guidelines, and I hold strictly to those guidelines. Nobody elected me to make policy. And so I cannot go outside my given authority and do something other than what this city council has told me to do. And so oftentimes, yes, the city's land use regulations do create seeming unfairness or hardship or results that appear unjust. And I would love, on occasion, to bend those rules and make circumstances less impactful. But I do not have that legal right. You have not given me that legal right. And just a reminder, and so if your citizens from time to time express the disappointment that the hearing examiner has held so rigidly to city ordinances, well, it's because that's what I am obligated to do by law. And so just that reminder, as you hear from people and how seemingly hard-bound my decisions may seem to be from time to time. The other aspect of equity is the more recent and topical one, and that's the concept of equity in housing. Equity as a discrimination issue rather than as a legal, the historic legal one. And that's a more difficult one. I think that's what was meant by the question posed to me by that city council. How was I achieving equity in housing consistent with the city's goals by my decisions? And I don't know that my answer would be much different to that question than to the general notion of equity. I don't make policy. I don't establish my own sense of rightness and wrongness. I allow the city council to decide that for me and do what the city council has told me to do. And so it is difficult to then, for me, to impart equity because, again, I can do it within the context of the land use regulations I'm given. But beyond that, I'm fairly hamstrung in doing so. So I would invite you to be thinking, as you have, to be thinking hard about equity and how you feel it can be achieved in land use regulation. It is a bit difficult for me to be creating that policy, but I'm happy to carry out anything that the city feels is worthy of consideration in the decision-making process. Let me just spin off on that in a very slight way. Again, I talked about the fact that I represent many districts or jurisdictions. In every one of them, I come in with a head free of any personal thought. The land use policies applicable in Lewis County are dramatically different than the ones in the city of Olympia. And yet, I apply theirs as they have written them, instead of applying any personal position I may have. And I take no different approach toward a city of Olympia land use issue, and that I come in with what the city has given me and have left at the door any personal thought I may have had. So in every jurisdiction, I give it the fullness of my thought, and I eliminate my personal thought. Whatever direction the needle goes among those jurisdictions. So I welcome your direction, and I will follow it, but do not expect me to come up with my own policy or to impose a sense of my own feelings toward equity or fairness. I don't feel that I have the legal right to do that. Now, I am mindful within your vision statements, your comprehensive plan, et cetera, that you speak to these issues. And so decision makings need to be consistent with that spoken vision. But nonetheless, that doesn't necessarily give me the right to go off on my own and do something noticeably different than what one of your land use regulations says under the guise of equity. And so, but if I'm rambling now, certainly this is an important and everyday issue as we have new proposed development, and it encounters resistance from surrounding uses that feel it's an intrusion, and because it's a higher density and perhaps it allows for a lower level of income resident and may have those impacts. I'm mindful that that allowing the project will achieve equity in the concept that it currently has today, but whether or not and I'm also mindful that there will be community resistance to that idea. I will take it as far as I can find regulatory authority and comprehensive planning direction, but beyond that, I am not establishing policy.
So I imagine it's common practice then for other hearing examiners that they don't necessarily weigh in on policy.
That's true.
Okay. So, in listening to what you're saying, it's not so much that we would be giving you the authority to set policy, but you do have some perspective and you have experience. And so what I'm wondering is, flagging something for us that is a potential equity issue is different than setting policy.
True.
Okay, so I'm just trying to understand, like, do you do that? Have you done that?
So Mayor, that
Yes.
segues into my last issue, which is, right now, you have a comprehensive plan that is pointing me in two different directions. Well, now, comprehensive plans are supposed to be in conflict in their policies. It's ingrained in the notion that in declaring your goals, some of your goals will conflict. They have to. They almost have to. But you have a set of housing goals that currently are pointing directly at each other in a way that is not reconcilable. And so that's on my sheet. The first two are announcing that you want your neighborhoods to stay just as they are. That is a strong preference. And then the other two says the only way you're going to achieve equity is you break that model. And so all I can tell you is everybody reminds me of those when a subdivision comes up, and it's which side of the table. One's pointing the one, giving me one direction, and the other is giving me the other. That's where your vision is. And so you are about to recycle your comprehensive plan. I'd invite you to revisit some of those policies and make sure that while they don't have to all say the same thing, it would be helpful if they weren't directly at odds with each other.
Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen, followed by Councilmember Parsley, followed by Councilmember Vanderpool.
Mark, going to the equity issues, I appreciate you being straight up with us, which is what I'm hearing for you. I also appreciated our initial conversation tonight about safe walking routes, and you're inviting us to take a look at it for high school students. And so that is just even tonight an example of flagging an equity issue. So I know that I'll join my council mates in an executive session to talk about your contract. And so I look forward to kind of exploring what we would like to see in there about this very topic, about equity issues. But that's something that is news to me about the safe walking routes, or their lack of proof of safe walking routes for high school students, and that's something I really appreciate. Some of this dialogue, I think you were a little bit self-deprecating about the additional dialogue, but it makes you more human to me. I know you've told a couple of times before when I've met with you, with everyone else around virtually, and you'd said you're not big on emotional polls, but it makes you a human, and it also for me, and it also gives us, I think, a broader look at the hearings examiner and what your experiences are. So I would personally, I'd like to see more of that. I'd like to know more of those suggestions, and knowing that they are just suggestions, and I respect that you respect that we're the policy authority. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, Councilmember Parsley, followed by Councilmember Vanderpool.
I have to appreciate what the Mayor Pro Tem has said. I totally agree with that sentiment. You said that you don't make the policy, but you rule based on which documents for the city. So if we were to put a policy forward, where does that need to exist for you to do that? Is that comprehensive plan? Is that code? Is that zoning? Where would we have a policy put forward that you would be able to say, hey, the council said this is an important aspect to this development?
I'm going to kick that can down the road. I would invite you to speak to your city attorney about
Mark,
where.
sorry.
Only because for me to start suggesting puts an obligation later on. If you do make certain changes, then I feel like, well, you did those too because of me. I think it needs to be from your advisors, not from me. I want to be as independent of your decision-making as I can be.
That's perfect. I guess what I was probing is that if you were making.
Let me try it slightly differently.
Okay.
Okay. You are revisiting your comprehensive plan, and I would invite you to think about areas in which you are speaking of goals that may be in conflict, and do you want to retain those conflicts? Are they mutually existing goals yet in conflict with one another, or has one become prioritized over the other, such that a new goal has risen over time that's more important than the prior goal?
Right.
And so that would be in your comprehensive plan review. In your land use regulations, you establish a list of things to be thought about for a subdivision. What things should be considered. For a conditional use permit, you identify things that should be thought about for conditional use approval. You are free to take a look at those lists and amend them if you feel appropriate. I do not want to invite or suggest a particular change, but those are ways in which you can more fully achieve or look at some of your policies.
I appreciate that answer. Thank you. And I got the look from the city manager and the city attorney. I have to ask this one question. When you were in school, did you ever think you were going to be a hearings examiner?
Oh, no. I had no idea of that, yeah.
So before we move on to Councilmember Vanderpool, City Manager Bernie has a point on this.
Yeah, I mean, to Councilmember Parsley's original question, it's kind of all the above, right? So the comp plan is the vision that we set with the community about what their expectations are and how they want our community to be developed and look like. And so code is where we help implement the comprehensive plan and our zoning policies and all those things. That's how we implement what's in the comp plan. So we need to make sure that as we do our code amendments, that's really, our code updates, that's where he's making choice points and decisions based on what's in code, right?
That's right.
And so code has to follow comp plan. And that's the work of staff and the council and the community working with us, is to make sure that our code does match the comp plan's vision for our community.
I missed the grand opportunity to boast for a second in response to your question about whether I ever saw myself as a hearing examiner. No, I did not. But my daughter last summer graduated from Columbia Law School with a resume that would have gotten her any job she wanted. And she chose to work for the Brooklyn Legal Aid Program for Housing. And I'd like to think that it's because she liked what some of her dad's things were doing. But who knows? But yeah, that's it. No, she's not coming back here. She's a New York kid now. But anyway, so yeah, sorry. That was unabashedly selfish.
Councilmember Vanderpool, followed by Councilmember Cooper, followed by Councilmember Madrone.
You talked about in some situations where under the legal historic examples that people would come to you and say, and then you would point them to us and say, you can't make these decisions because you're not a policymaker. Is there a method for folks to, besides emailing us, letting us know, is there a way for this to be recorded and sent to us more often about those instances where people feel that there isn't enough equity?
Well, inviting your staff to relay it, and inviting, gosh, you stumped me. It's a great question, but I'm not coming up with useful ideas. I appreciate the question. It's a good question. I'm just not sure how to carry it out. Because I'm not in that chain. And so the question is there some other mechanism by which people could voice those things to you? I'd leave it to your staff to offer you some advice on that. I'm sorry, I'm not coming up with a good
It's all right. I have my one-on-one with GA tomorrow, so.
Councilmember Cooper, followed by Councilmember Madrone.
Thank you. We lost our first name study session thing. This is a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate the way that you framed it because, as Jay just mentioned, the importance is in implementation, right? Like a vision and values around equity is not going to get us to the policy of consider A, B, C, D before you make this land use decision, right? And so I think that is something we need to carry. In fact, I feel like we should talk about how do we implement the equity chapter before we edit the equity chapter, right? So that we can think ahead of the final document and how to put it into, because goal one is bake equity in all policies and procedures of the city, right? Or something's high level, right? And then how do you do that? What does that look like to go and put it in all of the right places? So I just really appreciate that frame. So long way of saying that. And then Leonard, can you write a 2024 memo that addresses those conflicts that are in the agenda tonight? Because that seems like a pretty obvious one to me that should be clarified prior to updating the comp plan.
Certainly if I could, excuse me, just respond. Certainly in the comp plan update, I'd look to identify those. I already have the note written down right here. Identify all the conflicting goals in the comp plan, which is going to be a big chore, but I think we need to do that and bring that into the discussion for the comp plan. The adoption of the comp plan, of course, is yours as policymakers, but we certainly want to bring you those and try to clarify those, and particularly some of the ones that have been mentioned tonight. Where there might be conflicts in regulations, that's where we can use our interpretive decisions to try to balance that based on the direction you're giving us. So yes, we could do that in those cases.
So do you think the regulations play out the same conflict that he put of those four goals?
I think Nicole and Tim might want to add to this, but I think we've brought those to you as pretty regularly over the last several years in terms of trying to look at housing, what we've called potential barriers to housing in our codes and regulations and standards. And so we've tried to bring those to you as much as we can so that you have the opportunity to review those and change them so that they don't serve as barriers to the housing and equity goals that you have. And we'll continue to do that. I don't know if Nicole or Tim, if you have anything to add to that, but that's our goal as staff, is to carry out your direction by identifying those regulations that seem to be in conflict with what the policy direction is that you've given us.
Okay, and so then just to be really specific, you can't foresee a project that would come to play before our comp plan amendments that would put these in play? So that's what I'm saying is there needs to be a pause on that conflict sooner than later, it feels like to me, because it's a pretty big one.
It is. It's in a policy document, which is the comprehensive plan. So we don't have the authority either in terms of trying to change it. We can interpret it to the best of our ability in the direction that you've given us over time, including tonight, until that comprehensive plan gets in front of you and you're able to make those changes. But I mean, there very well could be a development that comes forward where that conflict has to be interpreted either by staff or by the hearing examiner, depending on the situation and where that decision is. And I think we've both said tonight we'll have to try to do our best to look at that, quote unquote conflicting policy and interpret it in a way that is consistent with what the council's direction has been.
Councilmember Madrone, followed by Councilmember Gilman.
Yeah, so the way we would traditionally do an update like that is what we did in 2021, and we would propose ourselves, an amendment for our docket for a comprehensive plan updates, but we've put a pause on that during the update itself. So, I trust that we'll get to that. And I also want to note there's not a plan to have a chapter on equity. It's something to be woven throughout each of the chapters. So I just want to make sure to say that, just so nobody, gets Oh, okay, you said both, okay. Yeah, but just want to make sure that folks know that's the plan for the comprehensive plan. And it's actually interesting to see some of this language in front of us tonight. In 2021, prior to 2021, this said existing single-family neighborhoods, and that's something that we updated as an equity issue. And maybe we do need to take it a little further. I see your note there. And I also wanted to note that there are changes to the expectations that the state has of us around our comprehensive plan update around addressing racial disparities in housing, in terms of, the housing needs assessment and what different planning for housing of, all income levels. And so there's some things that are going to be required of us around equity. So we've got our staff are very busy, working on doing all that. And I know that the Social Justice and Equity Commission is going to be involved, in the comp plan update, so that we got their eyes on, the things that they see as very relevant for their time. So I was jotting notes down as everybody was speaking. And then, it's interesting that the topic of succession came up. One thing that I remember from when we interviewed you is, for one, it was our goal to hire a hearing examiner and a pro tem hearing examiner. Yet we only had one qualified applicant, so congratulations, we have you here still. But we also did discuss, what succession looks like in the hearings examiner world, considering that, we have one qualified applicant and we like you very much, but, I'm sure you're maybe thinking about next steps for yourself in due time. And so in your opinion, or, if you have any thoughts that you feel comfortable sharing, should we think about going out for that pro tem position again, or is there anything that we should be doing to prepare ourselves as a city around succession for a hearings examiner?
Excellent questions. And I had that conversation with Tim earlier. First of all, I've given notice that I'm 68. I would like to practice for 2 years and then see how much continuing land use work I might do. But at least at that point, I would certainly want to dramatically reduce the amount of work I'm doing, perhaps retire altogether. Although the hearing examiner portion of my work is the most enjoyable and the thing that I'd like to do the longest. It's intellectually stimulating. Having said that, I'm of a firm that I'm trying to have one of my younger partners take a serious look at taking on all of these cities that I have accumulated. And so that is the goal for the next year and a half to a couple have expressed the interest. Now it's a matter of transitioning from that expressed interest into the capability to be a hearing examiner, especially for cities, complex cities such as an Olympia or others, in which your level of expectation is high. And so you don't want to be a training ground necessarily, but you want well-qualified individuals. So with all that in mind, yes, my goal is to make it, if the city would be so inclined to find a smoothless transition to another person with who I've worked with to make that happen. In the interim, as to hearing examiner pro tem, I have given Tim several individuals who I would strongly recommend who are hearing examiners in other nearby areas and who would be extremely well qualified to serve as pro tem hearing examiner. Did I fully answer?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Yeah, and I appreciate it too. And so maybe, Tim, I see you raising a finger there.
Yeah, I just want to add, we've been looking, for a pro tem since we went through the interview process with Mr. Scheibmeier a couple of years ago. The fact is, statewide, there is a massive shortage of hearing examiners. It's a topic that comes up at the Planning Directors Conference every year, through retirements primarily. And so we've reached out to several that are no longer taking cities, but Mr. Scheibmeier did give us a couple leads, and so what we'd like to do as staff is to come forward with the land use committee with some options, whether you want to do a full search or potentially just hire someone through contract as a pro tem. We haven't had a pro tem since 2014 or 15, so we've been lucky that Mark has been available for hearings, because right now we don't have a backup. In addition to succession planning, we need a backup. in case he's not available.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I appreciate that. And I was also reflecting on, something else that came up in your interview, and this is a couple of years ago, so, forgive me if I'm not, if I misrepresent anything that you said. But I was thinking about what you're saying in terms of like just a lot of engagement with neighborhoods and a lot of interest from our community in projects that are going up. And you said that one of the things that you wanted to work on for yourself is to like, rather than like get to the meat of the issue and make your determination, do a little bit more in terms of just kind of orating why you're making your decision and helping the community understand like why you get to the decisions that you get to. So I'm just kind of curious. You mentioned that in your interview, and like, how's that going?
Well, I'll have to digress. I'm fascinated that you remember all that because it's very much the conversation I had with Tim and Leonard earlier today, in that an acknowledgement that that's an evolving process, of making ourselves better and more effective in whatever we do, whatever role we have. But I acknowledge that from time to time I have antagonized neighborhood groups because of my determination to hold to the standards I feel the city has given me, that they look upon me as rigid and unwilling to consider their points of view, or they become very upset when I point out in detail that I'm not interested in petitions and other expressions of popular opinion, that I'm not allowed to consider the popularity of a project in my decision making, and it's only the facts, not its popularity, that drives me. Over time, I have learned to say that in a nicer way, to not change that policy, but to say in a way that's less in someone's face about it, and so that a neighborhood group doesn't feel like I'm poking them in the eye so much as just trying to provide good guidance before we get underway so we don't go down the wrong path.
Leonard.
Thank you. I'd really like to take the opportunity to thank Mark for our conversation earlier today, because he also had some great suggestions along those lines for staff as we're responding to questions that come up in a hearing. Less is not always more. It might make some sense to go through, even though we know that he knows the answer to some of the questions, or we don't need to go into detail for Mark, who's always extremely well prepared, but for the public who are there, and make sure they're understanding, kind of what the codes say, why that is the basis of the answer to the question that he might be asking us as staff. And so we do plan to try to do that a lot more too. It was a very helpful conversation. Appreciate it.
Councilmember Gilman, followed by Councilmember Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor Payne. So I'm thinking both about these sections that you pulled out, and in this conversation we just had, and also the last several years of just kicking the words neighborhood character all up and down under the table here. And I'm wondering if it's a false dichotomy, if it's polarization that's not necessary or helpful, or as Mr. Scheibmeier said, maybe there's other ways to frame and to state things so that you're not punching somebody in the face when they walk into the meeting. So I think that to say that one set of language is anachronistic and the other one reflects our current realities is missing an opportunity that there are characteristics, including the equity characteristics, that are going to continue to be considered, and some of those are about the character of the communities we live in, because taken broadly as characteristics, they are what determines what is necessary versus unnecessary barriers. And environmental protections fall in that same thing. Some environmental protections we feel are necessary barriers to some development proposals. And so I would hope that we could fold together these and that there's a way to frame the kinds of characteristics that we want to have in our community, and the kinds that we're even willing to say that's a must-have for whatever sort of future development, versus ones that are unnecessary Because otherwise, if we're making this strong polarization, we're saying there's really nothing that isn't an unnecessary regulation fee requirement. And I don't think the Ayn Rand world is where we want to go either, of just it's libertarian, build whatever you want. You can go out in the county and do that. So I just want to urge us to consider that we've sort of dug battle lines around these sets of paragraphs, and that just the way that staff has continued to navigate, leaving this ambiguity that Mark also referred to, that many communities are living with both of these kinds of language within their comp plans, that we can work, I think we can work to reconcile these two things. And it could be that there's some inflammatory phrases like neighborhood character that just, are going to blow a fuse. And so we have to, but what are the characteristics that folks are trying to preserve, and which of those do we broadly want to continue to consider when we decide what's necessary and what's unnecessary to protect when we consider applications. So anyhow, that's just in the spirit of there's so much polarization right now in all kinds of public policy discussions, and it doesn't feel good, and I don't think it helps. So, thanks.
Councilmember Cooper, followed by Mayor Pro Tem Nguyen.
Yeah, just real quick, I want to take us back to that succession conversation. I was thinking about the shortage as you were talking, Tim, and I wonder if there's an opportunity to modify the engagement we have with your firm to bring that legal apprenticeship to the table for this 2-year notice we just got, right? Like if he has someone in the house, can we figure out a way to make that resource available to the firm so that the people can do the work and learn? And then even if that person doesn't become Olympia's city manager or Olympia's hearings examiner, sorry, Jay, that was pretty funny. Even if they don't become our hearing examiner, then we've trained them up.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
and to me, there'd be a benefit to the whole world for that.
It's a great notion. And let me harken back to why I'm hoping for succession is to make the city's life a lot easier, knowing that it's a very difficult environment for finding experienced hearing examiners right now. That's why I have become the hearing examiner for so many cities in the last couple of years, is because it's just a short list. And at one point in time, I was flattered, thinking that it was somehow relating to talent, and ultimately realizing it had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with a shortage. But having joked about that, no, I think the opportunity to at least attempt a smoothless transition is enormously beneficial to the city. And so if I can work on that, I'd see it doing as much or more of a benefit than it would for us. So yeah.
And I think you're immensely talented, because I don't know anyone other than you that could leave their opinion at the door. And you're here because you do that in a remarkable way. And I think that's saying that leaves a legacy for the city that will go well beyond your service.
Well, and I have very good younger attorneys in my office that we've started the conversation with just kind of a question. This is a large commitment to a practice because of the number of communities that have come to me recently. And so it's a decision for one of them. Do they want to have as a significant portion of their future practice serving as a hearing examiner? And just like I had not planned for it, they had not either, and they need to be thinking about that change in their path, their arc. So, yeah.
And just to say finally that we're happy to have you in retirement, and you can work from any beach anywhere in the world, and we'll love to still have you.
You heard about my hearing in Kauai last month, but yeah, that was interesting. That was fun.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Scheidmeier. Do you have anything else that you'd like to share?
I was just going to say, if you did, otherwise I'm done. So.
Well, great. I will just say that I found this evening incredibly useful. So thank you for bringing these topics to us for discussion. And I think you've given us quite a bit to chew on as a council related to a lot of future decisions that we'll be making. So thank you. Any other questions or comments for Mr. Schottenmeyer? All right, seeing none, we are adjourned at 7:34.
Thank you so